At a glittering gala, a millionaire flaunts his mistress while humiliating his pregnant wife. But when she enters the room with a powerful, mysterious CEO by her side, everything shifts. Who is he? Why does the millionaire freeze in shock? One secret moment changes everything, and nothing will ever be the same. The chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls over the dazzling ballroom, each crystal catching the light and scattering it in 1,000 directions. The room was buzzing with life. Laughter, murmured conversations, the clinking of champagne glasses. A string quartet played in the background, elegant and soft, but even that melody struggled to compete with the chatter echoing beneath the gilded ceiling. Every corner of the room was adorned with opulence, polished marble floors, gold-trimmed columns, and tables set with fine china and flickering candlelight. The city's elite moved in calculated steps, dressed in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos, each one playing their role in a performance masked as a fundraiser. Everyone was watching everyone, smiling with polished teeth and speaking in compliments sharpened like knives. And in the center of it all stood Nathaniel Drake, the millionaire himself. Tall, broad-shouldered, his black tuxedo perfectly molded to his frame, Nathaniel moved through the crowd like a man who owned the room. And in many ways, he did. His empire funded half the city's developments. His name was attached to everything from skyscrapers to children's hospitals, and his face was frequently seen in financial magazines. The cameras always caught the same expression: smug confidence, sharp jawline, eyes that flickered with power. But tonight, there was something more in his eyes. A sparkle that didn't come from wealth, but from wicked satisfaction. Clinging to his arm was Camille, his new mistress. 28, stunning, and painfully aware of it. Her strapless gown shimmered in a way designed to attract attention, a deep red satin that kissed the floor with every calculated step she took. Her laugh was sharp, practiced, loud enough for people to turn their heads. Nathaniel didn't mind. In fact, he encouraged it. He wanted people to look, to see, to whisper. That was the whole point. And standing not far from them, near the dessert table, was Evelyn, his wife. Correction, his pregnant wife. Evelyn was a vision of quiet grace. 7 months along, dressed in a soft ivory gown that floated gently over her growing belly, she looked angelic under the soft lighting. Her blonde hair was pinned delicately into an updo, her features glowing not just from the pregnancy, but from the sheer willpower it took to hold herself together. But her eyes told a different story, pain disguised behind poise. Her hands clutched her clutch purse a little tighter each time Camille's laughter echoed through the air, every time Nathaniel rested a hand on the other woman's lower back in public, daring someone to question him. Guests pretended not to notice. But of course they did. They always do. That was half the entertainment at these galas. Observing the power plays, the scandals dressed in silk and poured champagne. A senator's wife whispered behind her glass. A business partner averted his gaze, and a former friend smiled politely, then looked away quickly, ashamed of the pity in her eyes. Evelyn remained composed, her posture perfect. She didn't react when Camille whispered something into Nathaniel's ear, lips brushing his cheek just enough to leave a smear of lipstick behind. She didn't flinch when her husband laughed, loud, theatrical, full of the kind of joy he used to reserve for her. She didn't even blink when a reporter took a photo of them standing together, Nathaniel's hand possessively on Camille's waist while Evelyn stood a few feet away, left out of frame entirely. But inside her, something cracked. Nathaniel caught her eye once across the room. Just once. A quick, fleeting glance as if she were another guest, nothing more. No warmth, no recognition, not even courtesy. Camille leaned in again, pressing her lips close to his ear. "She looks like a ghost," she said, giggling. "Are you sure she's even breathing?" Nathaniel chuckled under his breath. "She's just dramatic. Always has been. Still can't believe she agreed to come. I insisted." Camille raised a perfectly arched brow. "Why?" "Because I wanted her to see it," Nathaniel said. "To understand that her chapter is closed." Evelyn overheard none of this, but she felt it. The humiliation was thick in the air, invisible but choking. Her smile wavered only slightly as a waiter passed by with a tray of hors d'oeuvres. She declined politely. Her stomach had been in knots since she'd arrived. She hadn't wanted to come. Every part of her begged to stay home, curled up in bed, away from the public spectacle her marriage had become. But Nathaniel insisted on her appearance. said it would send the right message. She hadn't asked what message he meant. Deep down, she already knew. As she turned away from the center of the ballroom, she caught sight of her own reflection in one of the tall mirror panels. For a moment, she didn't recognize the woman staring back. Elegant, yes, but weary. She could see the heaviness beneath her eyes, the tension in her jaw. But there was something else too. A flicker of fire behind the sadness. A tiny ember not yet extinguished. She walked slowly toward the balcony, needing air, needing space from the gazes and whispers. The cool breeze hit her face, sharp and refreshing. The city lights stretched endlessly below her, glittering like scattered diamonds. It should have been beautiful, but all she could think about was the echo of Camille's laughter and Nathaniel's silence. She placed a hand on her belly, instinctively protective. The baby kicked gently, as if reminding her it was there, real, alive, a future she had to fight for. Her throat tightened, and for a moment, she allowed a single tear to fall. Behind her, the ballroom doors swung open again. She didn't turn around, expecting another couple to step out for a smoke or conversation. But the air shifted. She felt it, an inexplicable pull, like a current changing direction. Evelyn. She turned slowly. A man stood there, silhouetted by the light inside. Tall, sharply dressed, with striking features that hadn't changed much since she last saw him. His presence didn't scream for attention. It whispered authority, quiet and unmistakable. It took her a second to register him fully. And when she did, her heart skipped. Adrian. His name left her lips like a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. He smiled faintly. It's been a long time. It had. Years, in fact. He stepped toward her, hands in his pockets, his tone calm but piercingly warm. She hadn't seen him since before her marriage, before Nathaniel, before everything. He had disappeared into the world of corporate success and international headlines. And now he stood here, of all places, looking at her not like a broken woman, but like an old friend seeing her clearly. You look different, he said gently. I'm pregnant, she replied with a half-smile. I noticed. They both laughed softly, a strange comfort in the familiarity. Back inside, Nathaniel noticed her absence. He scanned the room briefly, then dismissed it. What harm could she possibly do? Outside, Evelyn leaned on the railing, her eyes now calmer, more certain. You're not just here by accident, are you? She asked. Adrian looked at her, holding her gaze. No, he said. I'm not. And though she didn't ask anything more, the weight of those words hung between them, rich with meaning yet to be revealed. Something had begun to shift. Something quiet, but unstoppable. What would you do if your partner humiliated you in public, especially while you were pregnant? Walk away or come back stronger? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Rate this story from 0 to 10, and don't forget to like and subscribe. You'll want to see how this twist unfolds. The next morning, the sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Nathaniel's penthouse, casting long rays across polished marble and minimalist decor. Camille stirred beneath the silk sheets, her limbs tangled like a cat that had no intention of moving anytime soon. Nathaniel stood shirtless at the kitchen island, pouring himself a black coffee and scrolling through headlines on his tablet, his jaw tightening slightly with each swipe. The gala from the night before had already begun echoing through the media channels. Photos were plastered across gossip sites and finance blogs alike. Him with Camille, her radiant and clingy. Evelyn in the background, overshadowed but unmistakably pregnant, caught mid-step or mid-gaze in most frames, as if her very existence had become a footnote in his curated life. He didn't like how much attention she still commanded, even as a side character in his own story. He clenched the coffee mug tighter. Camille padded into the kitchen wearing only one of his dress shirts, clearly amused by the online coverage. Look at this one, she said, holding up her phone. They called me the new belle of the elite. Isn't that poetic? She twirled dramatically before laughing. Nathaniel grunted, not looking up. Camille leaned across the counter, pouting. What? You're not enjoying your victory lap? He sighed, finally lifting his eyes. It's not a victory if people are still asking questions about Evelyn. Camille scoffed, reaching for a grape from the fruit bowl. They're asking because she looked pitiful, not powerful. You did exactly what you were supposed to. People saw you. They saw me. They saw we've moved on. Nathaniel didn't respond. He stared at the image on his tablet. Evelyn standing near the balcony, her hand resting protectively on her belly, a softness in her face that contradicted the sadness the world assumed she carried. Something about it bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Not guilt. He'd long since buried that, but a vague unease that refused to leave him. Evelyn had always had a quiet strength. He remembered how, in the early days of their marriage, she had been the one organizing galas, directing philanthropic campaigns, reviewing architectural plans alongside his team without blinking. She had been strategic, composed, radiant. But over time, she had softened, not in spirit, but in energy. He'd convinced himself she was fading, becoming too gentle, too domestic, too safe. That's what he told himself when he started looking elsewhere. And now that she had become invisible to him, her image still clung stubbornly to the public's memory. That was the part that irritated him. The following days passed in a blur of board meetings, press interviews, and high-end lunches. Camille was by his side in most of them, her presence carefully calculated, her comments rehearsed, her laughs timed with precision. She was more than just a companion now. She was part of his branding strategy. He dressed her, groomed her, positioned her exactly where she needed to be to complete his image of dominance and renewal. But as much as he curated her persona, there were cracks he couldn't polish away. Her impatience during meetings, her shallow understanding of business conversations, her tendency to speak when she should have listened, it all began to grate on him. At home, tension grew. Camille didn't understand silence the way Evelyn did. Where Evelyn would sit beside him in peaceful quiet, Camille filled every space with noise, questions, complaints, requests for attention. And in the quiet hours of early morning or late night, Nathaniel would find himself retreating to the study, sipping whiskey and staring at nothing, unsure whether it was boredom or fatigue that kept him awake. Evelyn hadn't contacted him since the gala. No messages, no requests, no dramatic confrontations. She had simply vanished into her silence, and somehow, that bothered him more than 1,000 screaming accusations would have. One evening, he passed by the nursery room, the one Evelyn had begun decorating before everything crumbled. The door was still shut, untouched since the day she left. He hesitated, then pushed it open. The walls were painted a soft sage green. A small mobile of hand-stitched animals hung above an empty crib. The rocking chair was still in the corner, next to a shelf of picture books with untouched spines. Dust had begun to settle on everything. He stood there for a moment, hand on the doorknob, feeling something tug at the back of his throat. Then he closed the door and walked away. Across the city, Evelyn sat on the edge of a doctor's examination table, hands folded tightly in her lap. The obstetrician was reviewing her charts, nodding occasionally. "Everything looks healthy," the doctor said finally, smiling warmly. "Baby's growing perfectly. You're doing a great job." Evelyn smiled back, grateful, but her heart was heavy. She didn't mention the stress, the sleepless nights, the way her mind spun each time she passed her reflection. She didn't say how much she missed feeling whole, but she nodded politely, thanked the doctor, and walked out into the hallway, holding her growing belly as if it were the only anchor keeping her from drifting into despair. Back at her apartment, she curled up on the couch with a worn blanket and a warm cup of tea. She stared at the muted television, not watching, her thoughts drifting. She didn't regret attending the gala. Not anymore. Seeing Nathaniel parading Camille like a trophy had been painful, yes, but it had also been clarifying. She had needed to see it with her own eyes to understand how little he valued her. And she had needed that humiliation to break free of any remaining illusion that she still belonged in his world. And then there was Adrian. Just the thought of him made her chest tighten in confusion. He had appeared out of nowhere, like a shadow from a past life she thought she'd buried. He had always been enigmatic, brilliant, intense. They had shared a complicated friendship before she met Nathaniel. Nothing romantic, but charged with possibility. But Adrian had disappeared without explanation, swallowed by the demands of his rising empire, and Evelyn had moved on. Or so she thought. Now, his sudden reappearance brought with it questions she wasn't ready to answer. Why was he really at the gala? Was it coincidence or intention? And why had his gaze made her feel, for the first time in months, like she still existed? Later that week, while shopping for prenatal vitamins at a quiet pharmacy, Evelyn received a text from an unknown number. Her breath caught when she saw the name, Adrian. It simply read, "Would you have dinner with me? Just dinner. No pressure. She stared at the screen for several minutes before typing a reply. Okay, just dinner. When she arrived at the restaurant, Adrian was already seated, dressed sharply but not overdressed, his demeanor relaxed but alert. He stood as she approached, pulling out her chair with quiet chivalry. You look radiant, he said. She chuckled softly. You always did have a way with words. They talked for hours, about everything and nothing. About cities he'd lived in, books they both loved, old memories buried in laughter. He didn't ask about Nathaniel. He didn't probe into her pain. He simply made space for her to breathe, to exist outside the shadow of her broken marriage. And Evelyn found herself smiling, really smiling, for the first time in what felt like years. When the evening ended, Adrian walked her to her car. I meant it, he said, pausing beside her door. You look radiant. But it's not just the pregnancy. It's something else. Something coming back. She didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. But as she drove home that night, the echo of his voice lingered. And deep inside her, something began to stir, something she thought was lost. Hope. The rain had begun to fall softly that evening, tapping rhythmically against Evelyn's apartment window as she sat at the dining table, a pen resting idly between her fingers. A legal envelope lay open before her, its contents already read but now acting as a stark reminder of her new life. Finalized property divisions, bank accounts closed, shared investments now transferred completely into Nathaniel's name. All neatly cataloged, signed, and sealed. A manila folder that held the remnants of years spent building someone else's empire. She stared at it not with resentment, but with a strange calm. It no longer stung the way it had weeks ago. Maybe because something had shifted in her since that night on the balcony. Since Adrian. She hadn't heard from him again, not yet. But his presence had lingered like a scent that clings to the fabric of your coat long after you've walked away from a place you didn't want to leave. She exhaled slowly and looked over at the small nursery space she was assembling in the corner of her apartment. It was modest, nothing like the grand, professionally designed room she had once envisioned, but it felt more honest. A little shelf filled with baby books, a second-hand rocking chair she had painted herself, a soft wool rug that she found at a street fair. Each piece chosen with care. Each object a statement. I can do this without him. She stood and walked to the crib, running her fingers over the smooth wood. A few weeks ago, this space would have made her feel like she was settling for less. Now, it felt like she was finally building something truly hers. Her phone buzzed, the vibration echoing in the stillness of the room. A message flashed on the screen. Can we meet again? I have something I'd like to show you. Hey. She felt her pulse quicken. She didn't hesitate this time. She simply replied. When and where? The following evening, Evelyn found herself walking into an upscale private lounge tucked away behind an unmarked door on a quiet street downtown. The ambience was a mix of warm leather, dim lighting, and soft jazz humming in the background. Adrian was already seated in a booth, a glass of bourbon in front of him, his attention momentarily fixed on a tablet in his hand. He looked up as she approached, standing to greet her with a smile that seemed to cut through every bit of doubt she had carried into that room. Thanks for coming, he said, gesturing for her to sit. You sounded mysterious, she replied with a smirk, settling into the booth across from him. Well, I suppose I did, he said, his smile softening. He slid the tablet across the table to her. Take a look at this. She glanced down at the screen, her eyes scanning what appeared to be the summary of a business project. At first, she didn't quite understand. There were figures, brand development notes, preliminary designs, projected market impact. But as she scrolled, something clicked. It was a proposal, a comprehensive business plan for a boutique wellness line, centered around holistic prenatal and postnatal care products and services. What is this? She asked, still scrolling. It's yours, Adrian said plainly. She blinked. Excuse me. I started drafting this after our dinner. I remembered how passionate you used to be about maternal wellness. You always talked about how neglected that space was, how women were treated like vessels, not individuals. I never forgot that. He leaned forward. You once said you wanted to create a space that treated motherhood with dignity, not pity. This is that space. Evelyn felt her throat tighten. She remembered that version of herself, the one who used to scribble business ideas on napkins, who used to dream out loud before marriage turned her into an accessory. She hadn't thought about those ambitions in years. Nathaniel had called them distractions. He'd said her ideas were sweet, but unrealistic. He preferred that she stay in the background, poised and quiet, the perfect image beside him. "I don't know what to say," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to say anything yet," Adrian replied. "Just think about it. You've got more than vision, Evelyn. You've got experience, empathy, strength, and now, a story people will connect to. You don't have to stay in the shadows anymore." She looked down at the screen again, running her fingers over the sleek lines of the brand's proposed logo. Something inside her stirred, a deep yearning she hadn't felt in so long it scared her. Could she really build something of her own now, after everything? Could she become more than the ex-wife of a millionaire? That night, she walked home with her mind buzzing. She kept thinking about the logo, the concept, the possibility of it all. And yet, a small part of her was afraid. Not of failing, but of being seen again, of stepping out from the safe cocoon of invisibility she had wrapped around herself since the divorce. But another part of her, the louder part, whispered something different, something closer to freedom. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Nathaniel's penthouse was alight with noise and laughter. Camille had invited a group of influencers over for a wine tasting, a promotional stunt she'd pitched to a new brand in hopes of launching her own lifestyle line. Nathaniel barely paid attention. He sat in the corner, swirling a glass of red wine, his phone buzzing with work emails he wasn't interested in answering. Camille flitted around the room like a butterfly, loud and bright and shallow. She smiled for selfies, posed for the cameras, dropped product names mid-conversation. But her laughter didn't reach her eyes, and Nathaniel noticed. Later, when the guests were gone and the silence returned, Camille curled up next to him on the couch. "Did you see how many followers I gained tonight?" she asked, scrolling through her phone. He didn't answer. She looked up, annoyed. "You've been distracted for days." "It's work," he said curtly. "No, it's her," she snapped. "You keep thinking about Evelyn. Don't pretend you don't." Nathaniel stared at her, then looked away. He didn't admit it. But she wasn't wrong. The next morning, Evelyn called Adrian. "I'm in," she said simply. He smiled on the other end of the line. "I knew you would be." And with that, the whisper in the dark grew louder. The scent of polished oak and sharp cologne lingered in the air as Nathaniel stepped into the sleek glass-walled conference room on the 40th floor of his corporate headquarters. The view of the skyline framed him like a portrait of power, but his mood was far from composed. A subtle tension had taken root in his posture, and even the most well-tailored suit couldn't conceal the restless energy beneath his skin. The presentation was ready. The numbers projected for the quarter looked promising, and yet something gnawed at him, something unspoken and unshakable. He rubbed his temples as the executive team trickled in, their clipped conversations filling the room with a low murmur. Camille had insisted on being present again, though Nathaniel had started to regret involving her in anything beyond cocktail parties. She had a habit of overstepping, of offering commentary where silence would have served better. But he allowed it, because for now, image was everything. She strutted in with a latte in hand and a blinding smile, dressed in another overly flashy ensemble that screamed new money, not legacy. He hated that he noticed. He hated even more that he cared. As the meeting commenced, Nathaniel began presenting future projections, his voice sharp and controlled. Camille, seated beside him, kept glancing at her phone, subtly photographing the room to post later on her social media with some pretentious caption about empowerment and innovation. He saw the senior partners exchange discreet glances. Their loyalty was intact, for now, but their respect was starting to fracture in tiny, imperceptible ways. He pushed forward anyway, determined to control the narrative. He didn't know yet that the true threat to his empire wasn't within this room. It was quietly building outside his line of sight. Across the city, Evelyn sat in a private co-working space Adrian had helped her secure. The walls were lined with modern art, the ambience calm, a stark contrast to the chaos Nathaniel often cultivated. She sat at a desk reviewing contracts, running through supply chain logistics, and sketching out product packaging ideas. It was all so surreal. She was doing this. Her fingers trembled slightly as she drafted her first email to a potential supplier, but she steadied herself quickly. Adrian had introduced her to a handful of trusted contacts, and she was meeting each opportunity with the quiet resolve of someone who had been underestimated for far too long. Her confidence wasn't loud, but it was growing. She had never felt this kind of purpose. Not even in the early days of her marriage, when she still believed she and Nathaniel were a team. This was different. This was hers. Adrian dropped by later in the afternoon, carrying a box of sample materials and 2 coffees. He placed them on her desk without ceremony and sat across from her, studying her as she worked. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "you're a lot more dangerous than people realize." Evelyn looked up with a faint smile. "Dangerous?" "Yes," he nodded. "You've got precision. You're deliberate. That's the kind of threat no one sees coming." She laughed softly. "I don't want to be a threat." "Maybe not," Adrian replied, leaning back in his chair. "But you're already playing the game, whether you meant to or not." She didn't respond, but his words stayed with her. Later that evening, she caught herself staring into her bathroom mirror, brushing her hair, and thinking about all the times Nathaniel had dismissed her ideas, reduced her voice, erased her presence. Maybe she hadn't set out to play this game, but now that she was in it, she intended to win. Meanwhile, Nathaniel's empire was beginning to show signs of hairline fractures. A confidential report landed on his desk from the finance department. Minor discrepancies in a foreign investment branch, irregularities in asset movement. Nothing dramatic yet, but enough to raise concern. He read through it twice before calling his CFO. "I want a full audit," he said coldly. "Quietly. No one talks about this outside your department." The CFO nodded but left the office looking troubled. Nathaniel knew that kind of look. It was the look people gave right before they started hedging their bets elsewhere. At home, Camille was becoming increasingly difficult. She had grown restless, bored with her role as arm candy and influencer. She had launched a brand of skincare products, but it was barely selling, and she blamed Nathaniel for not leveraging his network more aggressively to push it into exclusive partnerships. She didn't understand that credibility couldn't be manufactured in a press release. She wanted fame, Nathaniel wanted control. Their visions no longer aligned, but neither was willing to say it out loud. One evening, as they sat in silence during dinner, Camille suddenly blurted out, "What happened to the woman you used to talk about at every meeting? The one who used to sit beside you, write your speeches, vet your proposals?" Nathaniel looked up slowly. "You mean Evelyn?" "Yeah," Camille replied with a smirk. "Her. What did she do all day? Because if it was what I'm doing, I must be doing it wrong." He said nothing, but his silence answered more than any words could. Evelyn had never needed to demand attention. She had earned it with insight, calm strategy, and an intuition that now felt painfully absent in his daily operations. What Nathaniel didn't know was that Evelyn was no longer looking back. She was moving forward with quiet precision. With Adrian's help, she had secured a meeting with a powerful investor, one of the same men Nathaniel had alienated in previous years. She wore a navy blue dress and walked into the meeting with steady steps, her head high, her business plan in hand. The investor listened intently, impressed not just by her product, but by her understanding of the market. She spoke with confidence, her voice clear and unwavering. When the meeting ended, he shook her hand and said, "You don't just know your business, you believe in it." That's rare. Back in Nathaniel's world, things continued to shift. One of his most trusted partners suddenly announced a merger with a rival firm, a firm that had just received substantial backing from the same investor Evelyn had met. He didn't connect the dots yet, but the tremors were there. His world was starting to shake. That night, as he lay in bed, Camille already asleep beside him, Nathaniel stared at the ceiling, his thoughts drifting. He wondered what Evelyn was doing. He wondered if she missed him. He wondered if she even thought about him anymore. He told himself he didn't care, but the truth was beginning to haunt him. And for the first time, he couldn't ignore the whisper inside his mind, the one that sounded suspiciously like hers. The sun poured in through the wide windows of the penthouse, flooding the room with warmth that clashed sharply with the coldness hanging in the air between Nathaniel and Camille. Breakfast sat untouched on the marble island, sliced fruit, croissants, and fresh coffee cooling in porcelain cups, yet neither of them seemed interested. Camille sat with her arms crossed, scrolling through her phone, sighing audibly every few seconds as if orchestrating a symphony of dissatisfaction. Nathaniel stood at the window, his eyes fixed on the city below, watching the cars snake through the streets, his mind miles away. He hadn't slept much the night before. His thoughts had been tangled in quiet chaos, woven with threads of Evelyn's face, the strange silence from his partners, and the nagging sensation that something bigger was happening just beyond his reach. Camille's voice cut through the stillness like a blade. You know, it wouldn't kill you to pretend you're proud of me. Nathaniel turned slowly, raising an eyebrow. Proud of what exactly? She scoffed, tossing her phone onto the counter. Of me. Of what I'm building. Of the fact that people recognize me now for more than just being your plus one. He didn't respond immediately. He walked over to the counter, picked up his cup, took a slow sip of lukewarm coffee. You're getting recognition, he said flatly. Just not the kind you think. What the hell is that supposed to mean? Camille, you spend more time staging selfies and filming skincare routines than you do learning anything meaningful about the business world, he said, not cruelly, but with a growing edge of frustration. Do you even know what the core values of your brand are? Or are you just repeating whatever the marketing team writes for you? Her mouth opened, then closed. For a moment, she looked genuinely stunned. But then, her eyes narrowed. Wow, so that's what this is about. You're still comparing me to her. Don't do that, he said quietly. You are, she snapped. You don't say her name, but you bring her into every room like a ghost you can't get rid of. You walk around here like you're still living with her shadow. Nathaniel stared at her, not denying it, not confirming it. Because deep down, he knew she was right. Evelyn didn't need to be in the room for her presence to be felt. Her absence had weight, substance, consequence. He had underestimated how much she had anchored his world, how much of his success had been subtly supported by her intuition, her ability to anticipate problems, her calm way of solving things before they exploded. Camille, for all her beauty and energy, could not fill that void. She wasn't meant to. She was never supposed to replace Evelyn. She was supposed to distract from her. But now the distraction had started demanding more attention than it deserved. While tension mounted in the penthouse, Evelyn was miles away in a small warehouse space newly leased for her business. She walked through the open floor, observing as paint crews worked on freshening up the walls and electricians adjusted the lighting system. The place was far from finished, but it already had the bones of something extraordinary. She could see it in her mind. The production area, the packaging station, the calm reception space for consultations and events. Adrian walked beside her, clipboard in hand, discussing the first phase of rollout. But Evelyn wasn't just nodding along. She was making decisions, asking questions, pointing out potential flaws. She was no longer just following someone else's vision. She was shaping her own. Later that afternoon, as she sifted through vendor proposals in her makeshift office, she received an unexpected message from a former acquaintance, someone who had once worked in public relations for Nathaniel's firm. The message was brief but alarming. Be careful. Camille isn't who she pretends to be. Evelyn stared at the screen, heart thudding. She hadn't thought much about Camille beyond the obvious, the betrayal, the humiliation. But something about the phrasing unsettled her. She replied, "What do you mean?" The response came quickly. There are things in her past. Financial disputes, blackmail accusations. Nothing confirmed, but worth looking into. Evelyn sat still for a moment, processing. She had no reason to trust the source entirely, but something about it rang true. She thought about Camille's sudden rise, the way she had inserted herself into every corner of Nathaniel's life, how her influence seemed to extend well beyond what anyone expected from someone who was, until recently, an assistant in a lifestyle firm. And then there was her timing, appearing just as Evelyn was at her most vulnerable, just as the foundation of the marriage had begun to crack. It had all seemed too conveniently orchestrated. That night, Evelyn opened her old laptop, the one she hadn't touched since moving out. She dug through folders, emails, connections, anything that might link Camille to something. Anything beyond the curated image she now projected. What she found wasn't concrete evidence, but a pattern. A history of strategic proximity to wealthy men. Sudden career jumps with no clear qualifications. A trail of brief affiliations with companies that later suffered legal issues or mysterious internal conflicts. Nothing screamed criminal, but everything whispered calculated. It wasn't Evelyn's job to investigate further, but she knew someone who could. She called Adrian. "I need a favor," she said, explaining everything. "I'll look into it," he promised, quietly. Meanwhile, Nathaniel's frustration with Camille began to take new shape. One afternoon, she showed up unannounced at his office during a high-level meeting with international partners. She barged into the boardroom in a designer dress far too bright for the occasion, loudly greeting the room as if she were part of the agenda. Nathaniel's jaw clenched as murmurs of discomfort passed between the partners. After the meeting, he cornered her in his office. "What the hell were you thinking?" "I was supporting you," she snapped. "Isn't that what I'm supposed to do?" "You embarrassed me," he growled. "This isn't a red carpet. These people don't care about your brand. They care about legacy, structure, discretion." Camille stared at him, eyes sharp, no longer playing coy. "Then maybe you should have thought about that before you let me into your life." That sentence hung in the air longer than it should have. Nathaniel said nothing, but something in him recoiled, not at her words, but at the way she delivered them, as if she wasn't just reacting, but reminding him of something, that she had leverage, that she wasn't just some naive young woman enamored by power. She was playing a longer game, and he had no idea what the rules were anymore. That night, as he lay awake again in silence, Nathaniel realized something chilling. He didn't fully know the woman sleeping beside him. And worse, he didn't know what she was truly capable of. The city was beginning to turn in on itself with the creeping chill of autumn. Leaves gathered along the sidewalks, spiraling in gusts of wind as evening fell earlier with each passing day. Nathaniel stood in front of his office window, staring down at the street below where headlights flickered like restless fireflies. His reflection in the glass looked unfamiliar, hollow-eyed, strained, distracted. He could see the cracks forming around the edges of his life, even if he tried to pretend otherwise. It had started with whispers, subtle questions in board meetings, cautious emails from senior executives, shifts in shareholder confidence. Things he could once dismiss as routine corporate turbulence now felt heavier, more deliberate, as if something, or someone, was pushing against his foundation. And the worst part was, he didn't know where it was coming from. The confidential audit he had requested weeks ago had quietly turned up a few inconsistencies. Nothing scandalous, nothing illegal, but troubling nonetheless. Funds that had been allocated to a secondary venture account had been transferred without proper notation. An internal memo had been altered, signed under his digital credentials, but traced back to a device he hadn't used in months. A tech contractor flagged it as a minor breach, a technical oversight. But Nathaniel wasn't so sure. He had built his empire on details, and this wasn't just oversight, it was sabotage. Yet when he tried to trace it further, the trail went cold, buried beneath administrative layers and encrypted logs. He felt his grip loosening, and it was a feeling he hadn't known in years. At home, things weren't much better. Camille had grown increasingly volatile. She swung between sweet seduction and unpredictable outbursts, always demanding more visibility, more access, more control. She had begun meddling in business affairs, making casual suggestions during dinners with clients, inserting herself into boardroom conversations with overconfident ignorance. Nathaniel tried to manage it, but her presence was becoming a liability he could no longer disguise. Even his PR team had begun raising concerns, carefully phrased, of course, in polite memos and veiled warnings about brand dilution and demographic misalignment. He could see it in their eyes. They no longer saw Camille as an asset, but as a growing problem. One afternoon, he returned from a meeting to find Camille in his study, rifling through his desk drawers with an air of entitlement. "What are you doing?" he asked sharply. She turned, unfazed, holding a leather folder in her hands. "Looking for that stock transfer document you mentioned. I thought you said it was in here." Nathaniel crossed the room in 2 strides, snatching the folder from her grip. "This is confidential," he snapped. "You don't go through my private files." Camille narrowed her eyes. "We're partners, aren't we?" He didn't answer. He couldn't, because for the first time, he was starting to understand. Camille wasn't trying to share his world. She was trying to take it apart from the inside. Meanwhile, Evelyn was diving deeper into her own quiet revolution. With Adrian's support, she had moved her business out of the early development phase and into initial production. Prototypes of her wellness products were being finalized, her brand identity refined, her investor pitch sharpened. She held meetings with marketing consultants and product designers, negotiating terms with a fluency that surprised even her. The woman who had once sat silently in the background of Nathaniel's success was now commanding attention in her own right, and people were beginning to notice. Still, she couldn't shake the message she'd received weeks ago, the one warning her about Camille's past. Adrian had promised to dig deeper, and today he delivered. He walked into her office holding a slim folder, setting it on her desk with deliberate care. "You need to see this," he said simply. Evelyn opened the folder slowly, scanning through the documents. Past aliases, a history of short-lived romantic ties to older executives, a small but suspicious investment she'd received from a now-defunct firm tied to a known money laundering ring. Nothing overtly criminal, nothing that screamed danger, but everything suggested manipulation, calculated, predatory ambition. A woman who knew exactly how to move through powerful circles, how to embed herself where the money flowed. Camille hadn't just stumbled into Nathaniel's life. She had targeted him. Evelyn's hand rested protectively on her belly as she closed the folder. "He has no idea," she murmured. Adrian nodded. "Not yet." Later that evening, Evelyn sat alone in her apartment, thinking. For the first time in months, she felt an old instinct stirring, something she had tried to suppress, to leave in the past. It wasn't revenge. It was strategy. There was still a part of her that wanted nothing more than peace, quiet, closure. But there was also a growing part of her that wanted to protect the future she was building, not just for herself, but for her child. And protecting it meant facing the threats head-on, even if that threat wore designer heels and false charm. She began documenting everything. Her observations, the intel Adrian had gathered, subtle signs she remembered from her final weeks with Nathaniel. She didn't know what she would do with it yet, but she knew better than to ignore it. Her intuition had been screaming at her for months. Now she had the proof to follow it. Meanwhile, at the penthouse, Nathaniel stared at his office wall late into the night. The report from the internal audit was sitting unopened on his desk. His assistant had flagged it twice, reminded him to review the findings before the quarterly briefing. But he couldn't bring himself to read it, because he already knew, somehow, that it wasn't just technical errors anymore. Something was being dismantled. Something was being exposed. And he didn't know how to stop it. Camille entered the room, draped in a silk robe, sipping wine. "You've been quiet lately," she said, sitting on the edge of his desk. "You used to be more fun." "I've been busy," he muttered. "With what?" "Pushing away the only person who still believes in you." Nathaniel looked up, his expression colder than it had ever been. "Do you?" he asked. Camille hesitated. "Of course I do," she said, a little too quickly. But he didn't believe her. Not anymore. That night, as he stood on the balcony alone, the city stretching out below him like a silent witness, he felt something unfamiliar creeping into his mind. Not fear, not regret, but uncertainty. The one thing he had always sworn he'd never feel again. He just didn't know that the shadows he feared were no longer outside his empire. They were already inside it, threading quietly through every corner, whispering betrayal in a language only power could translate. The tension in the air was no longer subtle. It had become a constant hum that followed Nathaniel through every room, every conversation, every boardroom handshake that now felt too firm or too polite. Something had changed in the way people greeted him, in the way their eyes lingered a second longer than necessary, as if trying to read the truth beneath the surface. His assistant was no longer as quick to laugh at his jokes. His CFO had begun arriving at meetings with a stack of reports and a concerned look that never left his face. Even the building security had started asking for identification from his inner circle, a detail that Nathaniel found both irritating and ominous. And yet, no one said a word aloud. The silence was sharper than any accusation, and he felt it tightening around him like a noose. Camille, on the other hand, remained blissfully unaware, or perhaps just skillfully indifferent. She continued to stage photo shoots in the penthouse, often rearranging furniture to match whatever aesthetic her latest sponsored brand campaign required. The staff had grown weary of her demands. One maid had quietly resigned after being reprimanded for folding Camille's wardrobe in the wrong color palette order. Nathaniel began avoiding the apartment more frequently, seeking refuge in late-night meetings, extended business trips, and hours lost in the cold solitude of his office. He had told himself for so long that this was what he wanted: success, freedom, admiration. But now that he had it, all he could feel was a growing void he couldn't name. One morning, as he arrived at his downtown office tower, he noticed something unusual: a black SUV parked in the reserved executive space. His security team approached quickly, explaining that the vehicle belonged to a representative from a new venture capital firm that had recently acquired shares in one of his subsidiaries. Nathaniel nodded dismissively, but the name rang a bell. It wasn't just any firm. It was one connected to James Foster, a notoriously selective investor who rarely made moves unless there was a disruptive player on the horizon. Nathaniel had tried to court him years ago and failed. Now, the man was showing interest in his own house, without his knowledge or invitation. He didn't like it. Not one bit. That same afternoon, Evelyn walked into an exclusive networking luncheon at the Silver Terrace, a discreet rooftop club known for attracting high-level investors, philanthropists, and old-money aristocrats who preferred their deals whispered over truffle risotto rather than announced through press releases. She was greeted not with polite indifference, but with quiet admiration. Word had spread. Her venture was gaining traction, and her name was beginning to circulate not as Nathaniel's ex-wife, but as a formidable businesswoman in her own right. Her grace, her strategic insight, her calm presence, everything about her was drawing attention in ways Nathaniel's flashy image never could. She didn't need to command the room. The room bent naturally toward her. Adrian sat beside her, subtly observing the room while Evelyn exchanged pleasantries with industry leaders. "You're making waves," he said under his breath as the waiter poured sparkling water into their glasses. Evelyn smiled, her eyes scanning the skyline. "I'm just doing what I should have done a long time ago." Later that evening, as they reviewed projections in a quiet lounge, Evelyn turned to him and asked, "Do you think he knows?" Adrian nodded slowly. "He's beginning to feel it, but he doesn't know what it is yet. He's still looking for the storm outside his walls. He hasn't realized it's already at his door." Back in the penthouse, Camille was growing restless again. She paced the floor while on a video call with her social media team, frustrated over declining engagement metrics. "Why are the numbers down?" she snapped. "I've been posting more than ever." One of her assistants stammered something about oversaturation and inconsistent branding. Camille rolled her eyes and ended the call abruptly, throwing her phone onto the couch. Nathaniel walked in moments later, setting down his briefcase with a sigh. "What now?" he asked, already exhausted. "Apparently, I'm not relatable enough," she replied with a mocking tone, as if being beautiful and successful is a flaw now. Nathaniel didn't respond. He poured himself a drink and sat in silence, staring into the glass as if it held answers he couldn't find anywhere else. "You know," Camille said suddenly, sitting beside him, "I've been thinking maybe I should have a bigger role in the company. Something with a title. Something official." He looked at her slowly. "And what role would that be?" She shrugged. "Creative director, maybe. Or branding consultant. Something that makes it clear I'm not just your accessory." He studied her, his expression unreadable. He could see now that Camille wasn't just grasping for influence. She was trying to anchor herself to his world, to make herself indispensable before he could push her aside. But it was already too late. She had overplayed her hand, and her usefulness was shrinking by the day. Still, he said nothing. He nodded, smiled faintly, and said, "We'll talk about it." But he didn't mean it. That night, Evelyn received a formal invitation to an upcoming charity gala hosted by the prestigious Helmsworth Foundation, the same event Nathaniel was known to headline annually. Her name was printed elegantly on thick ivory cardstock. No +1 required. But she knew exactly who she wanted by her side. She picked up her phone and called Adrian. "There's an event next week," she said. "I want you there." He didn't hesitate. "Of course." She hung up, her heart steady, her mind clear. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about spectacle. It was about walking into that room not as someone who had been left behind, but as someone who had rebuilt herself from the ground up. Meanwhile, Nathaniel prepared for the same event with mechanical efficiency, unaware that a storm was gathering beneath the polished surface of his world. He reviewed speech drafts, approved catering menus, checked guest lists, and gave Camille full access to select her gown, anything to keep her occupied. But something in him felt off. He found himself double-checking security protocols, rereading the list of sponsors, and scanning the RSVP list for names that made his stomach tighten. And yet, nothing prepared him for what was coming. Because the storm wasn't in the weather forecast. It was walking toward him in heels and a tailored dress. The invitation sat on Evelyn's kitchen counter for 3 days before she touched it again. Each time she walked past it, she would glance at it sideways, as though it were something fragile and dangerous, something that could cut her open if she stared at it too long. The cardstock was thick, expensive, and printed with gold foil lettering that caught the light whenever the sun passed through the window. The Helmsworth Foundation Annual Gala, a celebration of vision and legacy. She had been to that gala before, of course, back when she was still Nathaniel's wife, back when she wore jewelry worth more than most people's annual salaries, back when her presence beside him was assumed, expected, curated. But this year, everything was different. This year, she would not be arriving as the woman clinging to his arm. She would be arriving as the woman who had walked away and come back stronger. She picked up the envelope and ran her fingers across the embossed lettering again. It felt heavier than it should, like it carried the weight of every moment of humiliation, every cruel dismissal, every silent night spent wondering where her husband was and what he was doing. She turned it over, considering it carefully, and then made her decision. She would go, not to make a statement, not to retaliate, but to remind herself and everyone else who she truly was. The following days were consumed with preparation. Evelyn wanted no part in theatrics, but she knew exactly how public perception worked. In a world where image could dictate opportunity, the right entrance could shift narratives. She visited a small, discreet atelier owned by a designer friend she had helped years ago, before Nathaniel had ever bothered to notice him. The designer greeted her with genuine warmth, offering his private showroom for a fitting. "You don't want loud," he said, eyes scanning her frame with an artist's precision. "You want devastating simplicity." She nodded. He selected a gown in deep sapphire, a color that whispered elegance without begging for attention. The fabric glided like water when she moved, subtle but unforgettable. He paired it with minimal jewelry and a pair of sleek silver heels. Nothing excessive, nothing performative, just power, wrapped in poise. As she stood before the mirror in the fitting room, she hardly recognized herself, but not because she looked different. Because for the first time in years, she saw herself clearly. She wasn't returning to that gala to reclaim something lost. She was arriving to reveal something found. Adrian met her at the apartment the evening of the event. He arrived early, as always, dressed in a midnight black tuxedo with a quiet presence that filled the space without ever trying to. When Evelyn stepped out of the bedroom, he didn't say a word at first. He just looked at her. Then, quietly, "You've never looked more like yourself." She smiled, touched her earrings lightly, and nodded. "I'm ready." They arrived at the venue shortly after sunset. The Helmsworth estate was a sprawling piece of architectural indulgence nestled at the edge of the city, surrounded by sculpted gardens and marble fountains. Cameras lined the entrance as black cars pulled up one by one, unloading senators, CEOs, celebrities, and their polished spouses. Nathaniel had already arrived, of course. He stood near the reception entrance, Camille clinging to his arm in a blinding gold gown that shimmered like foil under the camera lights. She posed with practiced angles, her laughter a little too sharp, her smile stretched just a bit too wide. Nathaniel's smile, on the other hand, was subdued. He had grown tired of these events, tired of Camille's endless need to perform, tired of pretending he didn't notice the cracks widening around them. But he still stood tall, confident, believing that nothing tonight could rattle him. He was wrong. The sound of murmurs swept through the crowd before Evelyn even stepped out of the car. A wave of subtle gasps followed as she appeared, stepping gracefully onto the red carpet with Adrian by her side. For a brief moment, it was as if time itself paused. Guests turned to look, conversations halted, cameras turned instinctively toward her. The contrast was striking. Camille's glamour suddenly looked excessive. Evelyn's presence radiated control, dignity, and an elegance that couldn't be mimicked. Nathaniel's breath caught before he could stop it. He stood still, eyes locked on the woman he had once called his. But she wasn't his anymore. And standing beside her was Adrian, the very man he hadn't seen in years, a name he hadn't heard since his early days in business. The man who now stood with quiet power and subtle authority, escorting Evelyn not like a date, but like an equal, like a partner. Evelyn didn't look at Nathaniel at first. She held her head high, exchanging greetings with other guests, her demeanor calm and polite. Adrian walked beside her silently, his gaze steady, protective without being overbearing. The two of them together didn't need to make a scene, they were the scene. And Nathaniel felt it like a bruise forming beneath the surface of his skin. Camille leaned in, whispering sharply, "Who is he?" Nathaniel didn't answer, because in that moment he couldn't. The realization hit him harder than he expected. This wasn't just a coincidence. This wasn't just Evelyn making an entrance. This was a shift in power, and he was no longer the center of the narrative. Inside the ballroom, the evening unfolded with practiced sophistication. Crystal chandeliers hung like stars overhead, and violins played softly as guests mingled over champagne and whispered gossip. Evelyn moved through the crowd with ease, engaging in conversations with old contacts and new admirers. Everyone wanted a word with her. Everyone wanted to know her story, and Adrian stood quietly by her side, letting her shine. At one point, the host of the evening made their way to Evelyn, offering warm congratulations on her new business venture. Nathaniel overheard the exchange from across the room, his jaw tightening as he realized that Evelyn wasn't just making a personal comeback. She was making a professional statement. He approached slowly, compelled by a mixture of curiosity, resentment, and something else he couldn't name. "Evelyn," he said, his voice carefully composed. She turned slowly, her expression neutral but unshaken. "Nathaniel." He looked at Adrian briefly, then back to her. "You look, well." "Thank you," she said simply. There was an awkward pause. "Didn't expect to see you here." "I'm sure you didn't," she replied, eyes unwavering. "But I belong here just as much as anyone else." Nathaniel swallowed hard. He wanted to say something clever, something biting, something that could re-establish the balance he'd lost. But there was nothing. No line sharp enough to cut through her calm. Adrian extended his hand politely. "Good to see you again, Nathaniel. It's been a long time." Nathaniel shook it reluctantly. "Indeed." Camille joined them, plastering a smile across her face. "So nice to see you again, Evelyn." "I doubt that," Evelyn replied, her tone gentle but edged. Camille blinked, unsure how to respond. Evelyn turned to Adrian. "Shall we?" He nodded, and together they walked away, leaving Nathaniel and Camille standing in the wake of a moment they hadn't seen coming. Later, as the evening wore on and speeches were made, Evelyn stood near the grand staircase, sipping sparkling water while watching the city lights beyond the window. Adrian approached quietly. "You handled that beautifully." "I wasn't trying to," she said softly. "I just needed to remember what it felt like to stand on my own." "You didn't just stand," he said. "You soared." And somewhere across the room, Nathaniel watched them from the shadows, silent, unsure, and suddenly very aware that the ground beneath him was no longer as solid as he believed. The ballroom buzzed with the rhythmic hum of small talk and champagne flutes clinking beneath chandeliers that glowed like halos over the elegant crowd. It should have felt familiar to Nathaniel. The smooth orchestration of luxury, the illusion of control, the performance of status. Yet, for the first time in years, he felt like a spectator instead of the leading figure he'd always been. He stood in a far corner of the room, nodding through a conversation he wasn't listening to, watching Evelyn across the polished marble floor. She wasn't just blending into the evening, she was owning it. Each step she took, each polite conversation, each subtle smile, all formed a silent symphony of power he could no longer claim. And beside her, Adrian stood like a sentry, unmoved, observant, connected to her in a way that disturbed Nathaniel more than he could articulate. There was no public affection, no performative displays between them, and yet the gravity between them was unmistakable. Guests gravitated toward Evelyn in waves. Some came for polite greetings, others lingered longer, engaging in hushed discussions that looked far more purposeful than casual mingling. Nathaniel noticed familiar faces, investors, donors, people whose allegiance had once belonged solely to him, leaning in attentively when Evelyn spoke. It was subtle but undeniable. The center of influence was shifting in real time, not with scandal or spectacle, but with grace. He hated how effortless it looked. Camille, in contrast, was growing restless. She had made her rounds, taken her photos, and attempted to redirect attention back toward herself. But something about the room's energy felt foreign. It wasn't responding to her the way it used to. The whispers weren't about her dress or her curated persona. They were about Evelyn. Even worse, they were about Adrian. She noticed the way guests greeted him, not just with courtesy, but with respect. People knew him. People remembered him. But more importantly, people listened to him. Camille didn't know who he truly was, but she could feel his presence eclipsing hers, and it stung more than she could admit. Nathaniel finally approached a group gathered near the bar, trying to reassert his relevance with a half-hearted anecdote about his recent investment in a tech startup. But halfway through his story, One of the listeners interrupted politely, excusing himself to join Evelyn and Adrian on the opposite side of the room. Nathaniel's words stalled mid-sentence, his voice lingering in the air, unanswered. It was the first time in years that he'd felt dismissed, not because of failure, but because he no longer held the attention he once commanded so naturally. It didn't take long for the ripple effect to become a wave. More guests drifted toward Evelyn, whose name was now whispered between toasts and beneath the strings of the quartet playing near the staircase. Her business venture was no longer just a passion project. It was a conversation piece, a rising movement tied to a woman everyone assumed had been broken. But here she stood, not only unbroken, but undeniable. Adrian leaned in slightly during a quiet moment. "You're making him unravel," he said softly. "I'm not doing anything," Evelyn replied, eyes steady. "Exactly," Adrian said. "That's what makes it so devastating." Across the room, Nathaniel found himself caught in another awkward exchange. One of the foundation board members, a man he'd known for over a decade, began praising Evelyn's recent progress. "She's really making waves," the man said, sipping his scotch. "Remarkable composure. Smart, too. I heard she's meeting with international distributors already." Nathaniel tried to nod politely, but the bitterness tightened in his throat. "I'm sure she's enjoying the attention," he said dryly. The board member chuckled. "It's not about attention, Nathaniel. It's about influence. There's a difference." Nathaniel said nothing, but inside, something cracked. A few moments later, the ballroom lights dimmed slightly, drawing attention toward the stage at the front of the room. The host of the gala stepped forward, welcoming the guests and thanking them for their support. As tradition dictated, the floor was then turned over for a few brief remarks from prominent attendees. Nathaniel was scheduled to speak, but just before his name was announced, something unexpected happened. The host, smiling warmly, gestured toward a familiar face near the side of the stage. "Before we proceed, we'd like to welcome back a familiar friend of this foundation, whose leadership and commitment to sustainable business has inspired many of us over the years. Please join me in welcoming Adrian Cross." A murmur passed through the room like electricity. Nathaniel's heart stopped for a second. The name echoed louder than the applause. Adrian stepped forward with quiet composure, nodding graciously as he accepted the microphone. Adrian Cross, the name that once held boardrooms in suspense. The man who had walked away from public business years ago only to return now, beside Evelyn. And suddenly, the pieces started to shift in Nathaniel's mind. This wasn't coincidence. This was orchestration. A slow, precise movement of influence beneath his very nose. Adrian's speech was brief, eloquent, and laced with subtle remarks that only the sharpest minds in the room would decipher. He spoke of sustainable leadership, of empowering underrepresented voices in the market, of recognizing the quiet strength behind innovation. Sometimes the most transformative leaders aren't the ones who raise their voices, Adrian said toward the end, glancing briefly in Evelyn's direction, but the ones who refuse to be silenced. The room applauded with fervor, and Nathaniel felt the ground shift beneath him. Camille leaned in, whispering nervously, "Who is he, really?" Nathaniel didn't answer. He couldn't, because he was still processing what he had just witnessed. Adrian wasn't just someone Evelyn knew. He was someone who could change the balance of power in this city. And Evelyn was no longer just someone who had been left behind. She was someone who had risen beside a kingmaker. After the speeches, guests continued to swarm Evelyn and Adrian, asking questions, exchanging cards, extending invitations to private meetings and exclusive events. Nathaniel tried to reassert his presence, but the spotlight had already moved, and he couldn't chase it without looking desperate. At one point, Camille grabbed his arm tightly. "We need to leave. Now." But Nathaniel stayed rooted in place, watching Evelyn from across the ballroom as she smiled softly at something Adrian whispered in her ear. He didn't know what the man had said, but he knew exactly what it meant. The thunderclap had arrived, and it hadn't made a sound. The morning after the gala dawned unusually quiet in Nathaniel's penthouse. The curtains remained drawn, allowing only faint slivers of gray daylight to creep across the floor, while Camille paced barefoot across the cold tiles in a satin robe, muttering to herself as she scrolled through her phone. Her social media feeds were flooded with images from the night before, some of her, of course, but far more of Evelyn and Adrian. News outlets and society blogs had begun publishing pieces titled The Unexpected Power Duo and Evelyn Drake's Silent Return, highlighting her calm elegance and Adrian's mysterious reappearance. Camille's name was barely mentioned, and even when it was, the tone was dismissive, surface-level glamour, background noise, the ornamental counterpart to a man whose relevance was fading. She tossed her phone on the counter with a frustrated sigh and turned toward Nathaniel, who stood near the window, silent and unmoving. He had barely spoken since they returned from the gala. Something inside him had shifted, something subtle but undeniable. He wasn't angry, at least not in the way he usually was. He was quieter, more introspective, as if trying to untangle a knot that had formed in the back of his mind. Camille thought he would explode after the way Evelyn had stolen the spotlight, but instead, he had withdrawn, and that unsettled her more than any outburst would have. "You're not going to say anything?" she asked, arms crossed. Nathaniel didn't turn around. "There's nothing to say." "That's rich," she snapped. "You let her walk in with him like that. You let everyone fawn over her. You just stood there while she humiliated you." "She didn't humiliate me," he replied flatly. "She didn't need to." Camille stared at him, incredulous. "What does that even mean?" Nathaniel finally turned, his eyes colder than she'd ever seen them. "It means she's not trying to tear me down. She's just being who she is. And that's more powerful than anything you or I have done in months." Camille's jaw clenched. "So what? You admire her now? You miss her?" He didn't answer. Because the truth was, he did. Not because she was his ex-wife, not because he wanted her back, but because he realized now just how much he had lost when he chose spectacle over substance. Evelyn hadn't needed to play games. She hadn't needed to posture or perform. She had simply returned, and in doing so, she had exposed everything hollow in his life. Meanwhile, Evelyn was sitting across from Adrian in her office, sipping herbal tea while reviewing her company's press coverage. The traction had been exponential since the gala. Her inbox was flooded with partnership proposals, distributor requests, media interview invitations, and congratulatory notes from people she hadn't heard from in years. But more than the attention, what struck her most was how grounded she felt through it all. There was no euphoria, no frantic excitement. Only a quiet confidence that she was finally walking in alignment with the woman she was always meant to be. Adrian looked up from his laptop. "You're officially a movement now." Evelyn chuckled. "That sounds dramatic." "But true," he replied. "You're not just building a brand anymore. You're redefining what resilience looks like. People aren't inspired because you're successful. They're inspired because you did it with dignity." She nodded thoughtfully. Funny how silence can be louder than noise. Adrian smiled, then grew more serious. "You should see this," he said, turning his laptop toward her. Evelyn leaned in, eyes narrowing as she read the contents on the screen. A leak. An anonymous whistleblower had sent documents to a journalist outlining discrepancies in Nathaniel's financial records. Not just minor mismanagement, but evidence of internal manipulation, asset transfers under shell companies, and questionable dealings with overseas partners. The report hadn't been published yet, but it was clear that someone was preparing to go public. Evelyn sat back slowly. "Do you think it's Camille?" Adrian shrugged. "Could be. Or it could be someone on the inside who finally got tired of being ignored." Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. "What do we do?" "Nothing," Adrian said. "You've already done your part. Let the truth unfold on its own." But Evelyn couldn't help the heaviness in her chest. She had never wanted to see Nathaniel destroyed, only to rebuild herself apart from him. Yet now, she could see how quickly everything he built was unraveling, and part of her mourned it. Not for the man, but for the version of herself that had once believed in him. That evening, Evelyn hosted a private dinner for her new advisory board, an intimate gathering of trusted voices who would help her scale her company. The atmosphere was warm, filled with laughter, wine, and meaningful conversation. Near the end of the evening, Adrian stood and made a toast. "To strength and silence," he said, "and to those who rise not by stepping on others, but by lifting themselves." The guests applauded, raising their glasses. Evelyn felt a warmth she hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just victory, it was peace. But across the city, the storm she had escaped was reaching its peak. Nathaniel's phone buzzed with alerts, media requests, legal inquiries, internal memos demanding explanations. Camille was nowhere to be found. Her belongings were still in the penthouse, but she hadn't returned since the morning. He called her twice. No answer. By midnight, she had vanished completely. The next morning, Nathaniel received an envelope at his office. No return address. Inside were copies of the leaked documents, each page stamped with red ink, highlighting transactions he couldn't explain, signatures he didn't remember authorizing, and transfers linked to accounts he never touched. At the bottom of the stack was a handwritten note. Your empire was never as untouchable as you thought. No signature. No clue who had sent it. And for the first time in his life, Nathaniel Drake felt something he never believed he would: helplessness. Evelyn, unaware of the envelope's contents, walked through her warehouse later that day, overseeing the setup of the new product line. As she passed by the assembly station, she paused and ran her fingers along one of the finished packages. Her name was nowhere on the label, but her fingerprint was in every detail. Every scent, every texture, every note, it was all her. She smiled quietly to herself, unaware of just how much farther her impact would reach. Because the unveiling wasn't just a moment at a gala. It was a shift, a turning point, and the world had begun to take notice. The silence in Nathaniel's office was no longer a space for focus. It was a vacuum, thick with the weight of unraveling control. The blinds were drawn, the lights dimmed, and the walls, once adorned with framed awards and certificates of achievement, now felt like looming reminders of a legacy slipping through his fingers. The stack of leaked documents remained untouched on his desk since their delivery 2 days earlier, but he knew every detail by heart. He had read them until the words blurred into each other, until the numbers danced across the page like ghosts, taunting him with truths he couldn't deny. The discrepancies were real. The signatures matched. The shell accounts existed. And the worst part was, he still had no idea how or when it had all begun. Somewhere along the line, he had stopped paying attention. Somewhere, between flaunting Camille and silencing Evelyn, he had allowed cracks to grow into fractures, and now the entire structure was beginning to collapse. Outside his office, whispers multiplied like wildfire. His executive assistant had grown unusually formal, her once warm tone now replaced by clipped responses and curt nods. His CFO requested an emergency meeting, arriving with grim eyes and a resignation letter already printed. Several of his long-standing board members had started distancing themselves, some through subtle absences from meetings, others by transferring their shares or reaching out to competitors behind closed doors. The financial press, always hungry for scandal, had caught scent of the blood in the water, and as articles began to circulate, speculations multiplied. Allegations became headlines. Headlines became narratives. And Nathaniel, once the figurehead of strength and innovation, was being recast as reckless, careless, perhaps even complicit. His phone buzzed continuously, but he had stopped answering. Lawyers, reporters, investors, associates pretending to offer help while subtly probing for weaknesses. Even Camille had gone completely silent. No calls, no messages, no signs of life. He wasn't sure whether to be angry or relieved. A part of him suspected she had known all along. Maybe she hadn't planned it, but she'd certainly benefited from it. Perhaps she'd seen the cracks before he did and simply jumped ship before it sank. He glanced toward the bar cart in the corner of his office, then turned away. He didn't need another drink. He needed answers. Meanwhile, Evelyn's world had never felt more grounded. Her company's launch had exceeded expectations, not only in sales, but in resonance. Women from across the country were sharing their stories, connecting with her brand not just as consumers, but as a community. Her social media presence had grown organically, with genuine engagement rather than fabricated hype. Influential women in wellness, maternal health, and entrepreneurship were beginning to feature her work on their platforms, praising her for her authenticity, her vision, her ability to translate vulnerability into purpose. And while the media still enjoyed spinning tales of her revenge arc, Evelyn herself refused to participate in that narrative. She remained gracious in interviews, deflecting questions about Nathaniel, speaking only about her mission, her values, and the future she was building. One afternoon, while reviewing a new marketing campaign, her assistant entered the office holding a sleek white envelope. "This just arrived," she said. Evelyn opened it slowly, revealing a formal invitation to speak at a global business summit, an event she had once watched from the sidelines as Nathaniel's guest. Now, she was the keynote. She sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the shift. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt whole. Adrian entered a few minutes later, sensing the weight in her expression. "Everything all right?" he asked. She handed him the invitation. He read it and smiled. "Full circle." "I suppose it is," she said softly. He sat beside her, watching her for a moment. "You've earned this." She nodded. "I just wish I'd realized sooner that I didn't need anyone to validate what I was capable of." "You needed time," he said. "You needed to remember who you were." "And what about you?" she asked, tilting her head. "Why did you come back?" Adrian paused. "Because I believed in what you were building. And because I knew, deep down, that you'd change the world if you just remembered your own voice." Their eyes met in quiet understanding. It wasn't about romantic tension. It was about partnership, mutual respect, the rare kind of bond formed not by necessity, but by shared purpose. Back in Nathaniel's world, the walls continued to close in. His legal team delivered a preliminary report outlining the potential fallout from the leaked documents. Civil litigation was likely. Criminal charges weren't out of the question. His assets were being frozen pending investigation. One of his offshore partners had already issued a public statement distancing themselves from his company, and a second had initiated an internal review of their dealings with him. The spiral was no longer hypothetical. It was real, visible, irreversible. Camille's name appeared again, this time in a new leak. A confidential email chain revealed her involvement in redirecting some of the suspicious transactions. Her fingerprints were all over the mess, but cleverly, she had made sure most of the responsibility traced back to Nathaniel. The media latched onto the story immediately. The mistress who vanished, they called her. A siren who had sung the king into ruin, then disappeared into the mist. Nathaniel knew the truth was more complicated. But he also knew perception was reality, and his had been irrevocably tainted. One by one, the last of his allies fell away. His business empire fractured into separate entities, his name scrubbed from websites, his photos taken down from office walls. The company he had built, the legacy he had once imagined passing on, now existed without him. It was a quiet erasure, not with violence, not with fire, but with silence. And it was that silence that haunted him most. He walked through the empty corridors of his corporate headquarters one last time, passing by closed doors and abandoned desks. The building echoed with the absence of voices, the absence of purpose. He stopped outside the executive boardroom, staring at the polished plaque that still bore his name. Slowly, he reached up and removed it. It felt strangely weightless in his hand. That evening, Evelyn sat on her apartment balcony, a warm breeze brushing against her skin as she held a letter she had written weeks earlier but never sent. It wasn't bitter. It wasn't angry. It was simply a goodbye, a closure not for Nathaniel, but for herself. She folded it neatly, placed it in an envelope, and dropped it into the fire pit beside her. The flames devoured it quietly, and she watched until it turned to ash. Across the city, Nathaniel sat alone in a dimly lit lounge. No cameras, no admirers, no mistress. Just a man, surrounded by echoes of his own making, watching his kingdom crumble not with thunder, but with a whisper. The final days of autumn carried a hush across the city, a strange quietness that wrapped the skyline in muted gold and gray. Leaves tumbled along sidewalks, scattering in gusts of wind like forgotten pieces of time. Evelyn stood by the tall windows of her office, her hand wrapped around a warm cup of tea, watching the season shift outside. It had been weeks since the headlines had changed their tune. What had begun as whispers of financial scandal had erupted into a full-scale media frenzy, one that no public relations team could contain. Nathaniel Drake's empire had collapsed, not with a bang, but like a structure eaten away by rot, crumbling from the inside until all that remained was a hollow frame of what once stood tall. The stories were everywhere now, about the offshore accounts, the manipulation of shareholders, the ghost transactions, and, most damning of all, the revelations surrounding Camille's quiet betrayal. And yet Evelyn didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply watched the wind move through the trees, feeling neither victorious nor vindicated, but rather at peace. She had survived the storm, but more importantly, she had outgrown the world that created it. Her company had continued to flourish, not only in profit but in reach. She had just signed a multi-country distribution deal that would expand her wellness line internationally. Her products were being featured in high-end boutiques and wellness expos, but also in community-driven clinics and maternal health programs, just as she dreamed. Her mission had never been about luxury. It was about dignity, restoration, empowerment. And the world was beginning to understand that. Invitations for speaking engagements flooded her inbox. Mentorship requests poured in from young entrepreneurs, and even investors who had once overlooked her were now asking to meet. But Evelyn remained selective. She was no longer interested in building for the sake of scale. She wanted meaning. She wanted intention. And she had no desire to recreate the cold, hollow empire she had once been a silent pillar of. Adrian entered her office, carrying a folder filled with press updates and new contracts to review. He placed them gently on her desk, but paused as he looked at her, eyes soft. "You're quiet today." "Just thinking," she said, her voice calm. "About everything." He nodded and took a seat across from her. "It's a strange kind of peace, isn't it? When the noise finally fades." "Yes," she said. "Strange, but welcome." There was a brief silence between them, not uncomfortable, but reflective. Evelyn finally broke it. "Do you ever think about how things might have been if we'd stayed in touch all those years ago?" Adrian looked at her thoughtfully. "I used to," he admitted. "But now, I think everything happened exactly the way it needed to." She smiled gently. "So do I." Later that evening, Evelyn attended a fundraising event hosted by a foundation supporting single mothers and small women-owned businesses. She wasn't the main speaker, nor the central figure, just a guest among others, seated at a round table with community leaders and young entrepreneurs. And that's how she liked it. She shared stories when asked, listened intently when others spoke, and offered insight not from a pedestal, but from a place of shared experience. She no longer needed recognition. She simply wanted to uplift others the way she had once needed to be uplifted herself. After the event, a young woman approached her shyly. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said. "Not just for your business, for your strength. Your story helped me believe I could start again." Evelyn placed a gentle hand on the woman's shoulder. "You don't need to start over to be strong," she said. "You only need to remember who you are." Across the city, Nathaniel sat in a small, modest apartment far from the penthouse skyline he once ruled. The walls were bare, the furniture basic, the silence deafening. He stared at a worn leather-bound notebook on the table in front of him, the only item he'd kept from his office, filled with handwritten notes from the early years of his career. Ideas, plans, quotes from mentors long forgotten. He flipped through the pages slowly, as if searching for the version of himself that had once dreamed beyond profit margins. But there was no answer in the pages, no redemption written between the lines. Just echoes of a man who had chosen image over substance and had paid the price for it. He had made no public statements since the collapse. He had refused interviews, turned down offers for redemption arcs, book deals, exclusive exposés. Not out of nobility, but because he had nothing left to say. He had lost everything. His company, his influence, his fortune. But perhaps most painfully, he had lost the only person who had ever truly believed in him without needing anything in return. And he hadn't even realized it until it was too late. One morning, he walked to a small bookstore in his neighborhood and saw Evelyn's name on the cover of a newly released business anthology, an essay she had written titled Grace in the Wake. He picked it up carefully, standing in the aisle as he read the first paragraph. It wasn't about him. It wasn't even about betrayal. It was about resilience, about choosing purpose over pain, about rising without bitterness. And though her name was printed in clean, bold letters on the page, her voice carried more than ink. It carried evolution. Nathaniel returned the book to the shelf and walked out quietly. He didn't buy it. He didn't need to. He had already read every word of her strength in the chapters of their life together. He just hadn't recognized it at the time. Weeks later, Evelyn stood by a riverbank during a wellness retreat she had organized for new mothers. The air was cool, the sound of water rushing over smooth stones creating a gentle rhythm beneath the soft laughter of women gathered around picnic blankets and baby carriers. She knelt beside a young mother struggling with a colicky infant, gently rocking the baby in her arms, whispering comfort. It was a small moment, unnoticed by cameras or media, but to Evelyn, it was everything. These were the moments that mattered, the ones that didn't make headlines, but built futures. Adrian approached quietly, offering her a water bottle, and together they sat by the river in peaceful silence. He looked at her, not with admiration, but with deep respect. And for a moment, Evelyn allowed herself to breathe in the fullness of everything she had become, not because of revenge, not because of loss, but because she had chosen a different path. And somewhere, in a quiet apartment beneath a pale sunrise, Nathaniel poured himself a cup of coffee in silence. No fanfare, no headlines, just a man learning, too late, that empires built on ego fall silently, while grace endures with every quiet step forward.